So in the last lecture for the week, we want to take a look at the final learning outcome, the breakthroughs forged by African Americans in the 1950s, and the retaliatory movement that came to be called massive resistance. Now I want to call attention to the image that we have at the beginning of the lecture, and the gentleman on the right-hand side of the photograph and what the words are on his sign. Racial bias here helps communism everywhere. An analysis of the civil rights movement in the 1950s through the lens of the Cold War goes a long way to explaining why the civil rights movement, which didn't begin in the 1950s, it was a long-standing movement even before the abolition of slavery, but in a modern sense it started to achieve victories during the 1950s. And the Cold War can go a long way in explaining why the civil rights movement started to achieve victories in the 1950s. Because just as the Berlin airlift and German children running out to scream in the streets, the Americans are bombing us and they're bombing us with chocolate-covered raisins, was a public relations disaster for Stalin. Each lynching or bombing or act of violence to keep segregation in place in the United States was a public relations disaster for America. And insofar as the America ideas of democracy and protection of the individual, well, the United States had to practice that at home before it could preach it internationally. And as the Cold War shifted from Europe, and we see it quickly did, from Europe to Asia and then to other parts of the world, the Soviet Union could point to the United States' treatment of minorities within its own country as a reason why countries in the Third World, in Asia, and in Africa and Latin America should not ally with the United States and should actually ally themselves with the Soviet Union instead. And so in order to combat the Cold War internationally more successfully, the United States really had to get its house in order. And there were significant breakthroughs in civil rights during the 1950s and the early part of the Cold War. European immigrant groups, they were for the most part assimilated into American culture. Italians and Irish, Germans, and other Eastern Europeans were assimilated into greater Anglo-American culture. Truman, by executive order, is going to desegregate the armed forces on July 26, 1948. But I do want to call attention to the headline right underneath the major headline, President Truman wipes out segregation in armed forces, where we see posse bent on lynching, searches woods for prey. The contrast between those two headlines couldn't be more stark and more indicative of what race relations and the civil rights movement was up against in the 1950s. And the unifying experience of fighting in World War II is going to go a long way in explaining why Italians and Irish and other Southern European and Eastern European groups were homogenized into greater American culture. And it also goes a long way in explaining why Jackie Robinson is going to be the first African American to break the color barrier in Major League sports. He's 28 years old and he's going to play for Brooklyn Dodgers for the first time in April of 1947. He'll eventually make his way into the Hall of Fame along with other players who played in the Negro Leagues like Satchel Paige. Now, there weren't just successes in popular culture and sports. The real victories of the civil rights movement are going to be via the judicial branch. So it's important to get a little bit of background information on the Supreme Court because of the enormous consequences its decisions are going to have in some key court cases. In 1953, the Supreme Court gets a new Chief Justice when Eisenhower nominates Earl Warren for the position. He's a three-time governor from California, Republican. He's the governor at the time of Japanese internment, and in somewhat of a surprise for Eisenhower and other traditional constitutionalists, Chief Justice Earl Warren is going to steer the court through his vision of judicial activism, in which the Constitution needs to be interpreted through the time and evolve with the time. He becomes Chief Justice right in the middle of the Brown v. Board of Education, a landmark decision that strikes down segregation, and schools in particular are ordered to desegregate with all due haste. And even before Earl Warren joined the court in 1948, there was an especially important case called Shelley versus Kramer, which outlawed something called restrictive covenants. This is this idea of adding some sort of legal clause where someone wouldn't sell to a racial minority. And that with all due haste clause proved problematic. But by 1957, Arkansas was ready to attempt the desegregation of its Central High School in Little Rock by 9 black students attending. The Little Rock Nine had agreed that they were going to meet together outside of the school and go in as a group, and there would be friendly faces from the NAACP and other organizations that would help support them as they moved into the school. Now, on the agreed upon day that the Little Rock Nine was going to go into the school together, an angry crowd had surrounded the school, and troops from the Arkansas National Guard had been called in by the governor Orville Fabus, not to protect the students, but to bar them. The conditions were deemed unsafe, and so the Little Rock Nine decided not to go to the school and meet at the appointed time at the appointed place to go into Central High School together. One of the Little Rock Nine, Elizabeth Eckford, doesn't get the memo, and she shows up and she is by herself. There is no one else from the school that was supposed to integrate with her on the day, no supporters from church groups or the NAACP. Elizabeth approaches a National Guardsman thinking that he might be there to maintain order and could assist her, and he abruptly tells her to go home and that she's not wanted there. And the images of Elizabeth Eckford's treatment and the Little Rock Nine when they did eventually meet up and try to get into the school and they're blocked by the National Guard. These are making national and international headlines in print and on television. And so President Eisenhower is not going to tolerate a governor refusing to institute a legal order from the Supreme Court. And in response to Orville Fabus's calling in the Arkansas National Guard, Eisenhower is going to mobilize and call in the 101st Airborne Division. And they're going to arrive on September 24th, 1957 to ensure that the Little Rock can safely enter Central High School and begin receiving an education. But the federal troops couldn't stay mobilized in Little Rock, Arkansas, and as soon as they left, the segregationist groups arrived back at the school. And then at the beginning of the school year in 1958, using a tactic that many school districts in the South are going to use, Orville Fabus is going to close Little Rock's public school to make sure that the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, desegregating schools, doesn't have to be implemented. And this is called the Massive Resistance, this campaign that begins in the wake of the Supreme Court decision to resist. And it's a little hard to see on the billboard, but if you look carefully, you can see that it says impeach Earl Warren. It was Earl Warren. It was the Warren Court who did this. And there will be a document that's created and crafted by Southern politicians called the Southern Manifesto. And what it's going to is fan the fuels of racial hatred in the South and give them a bit of political legitimacy. Strom Thurmond, a senator from South Carolina, this gentleman here, is going to draft the first copy. And what the Southern Manifesto is a political repudiation of the Brown versus Board of Education decision by Southern politicians. Quote, the unwarranted decision of the Supreme Court in the public school cases is now bearing the fruit always produced when men substitute naked power for established law. Only 3 Southern politicians are not going to sign this document in March 1956. Al Gore Sr., Lyndon Johnson from Texas, who will soon become vice presidential nominee under John F. Kennedy, and Estes Kefauver from Tennessee. And this document is calling for resistance in this, that citizens should actively resist integration. And so instead of being responsible politicians committed to the rule of law, politicians who signed the Southern Manifesto appealed to emotions and prejudice. Now, the next key landmark in the civil rights movement in the 1950s is the murder of Emmett Till. He's a 14-year-old northerner from Chicago. He goes down to visit relatives in Mississippi, and when he's socializing with his cousins, it's like he's coming from a completely different world. He's showing them pictures of what his school looks like in Chicago, his friends who are white, and he hasn't grown up in the culture of fear and intimidation that his cousins have in this. He's accused of whistling at a white woman, and because of this alleged whistling, the husband of the woman, Mr. Roy Bryant, and his half-brother, John Millam, appear at the cabin that Emmett is staying at with his relatives in the middle of the night. They accost him, threatening those at the house with murder should they try to intervene. Emmett Till is beaten, tortured, and murdered with a gunshot wound to his head. His body is tied to an industrial fan via barbed wire, and he is dumped into the Tallahatchie River, where he is discovered by 2 children fishing 2 days later. Bryant and Millen are eventually charged with the murder of Emmett Till, and it takes an all-white jury just 67 minutes to acquit them of the slaying. And again, this is another episode that makes national and international headlines. The Emmett Till case provokes outrage across the country and international, even more so when in 1956, in an interview, Bryant and Millam confessed Now, one of the key decisions throughout this entire case is when Emmett Till's body is finally returned to his mother in Chicago, she refuses to have a closed casket. She wants an open casket so that the world can see what these men in the South did to her baby boy. And this is the type of imagery that the Soviet Union can use and promote their cause around the world. But look at the type of violence that Americans are perpetrating against Americans of a different color. And another key moment in the civil rights movement in the 1950s would be the bus boycotts that began in the South to desegregate bus lines. The first successful bus boycott was in 1953 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And because of that success, the NAACP and other African American groups would desegregate other major cities' bus lines in the South. And the most famous of these bus boycotts is going to be on Montgomery from December 5th, 1955 to December 20th, 1956, where famously Rosa Parks is going to refuse to give up her seat in the whites-only section of the bus. Rosa Parks was a member of the NAACP. She was one of the few African-American women in Alabama who passed their literacy test, and her resistance on that day was deliberate, and she knew that she was probably going to get arrested, but that's what they needed in order to mobilize, and the busing lines had to back down. A sizable portion, if not a majority, of the frequenters of the public transportation system in southern cities were African Americans. So they had an economic power in this instance and weren't afraid to use it. And the Montgomery bus boycott is also going to be important because it's going to launch the civil rights career of Martin Luther King. And the Montgomery bus boycott and the rise of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to lead to the formation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference on January 10th, 1957 in Atlanta, Georgia, and the civil rights movement in the South will be fully galvanized. But as this lecture shows, there is still a lot of work to do for the United States insofar as civil rights is concerned. And so when we speak next week in the 1960s, we will continue this conversation about what's going on in civil rights during the Cold War. Now, what are the main conclusions that we want to draw regarding the Cold War in the 1950s? Well, atomic power and the Soviet Union's attempt to create a buffer state in Europe are going to cause the Cold War. The Cold War contributed to conservatism, but many Americans adjusted to a comfortable existence replete with good wages and luxury items. We will see the rise of McCarthyism and the Second Red Scare. That's going to begin as a crusade against communist influence by curtailing civil liberties and political dissent. And African Americans started mobilizing for a revolt against racism and started the civil rights movement.